This exhibition was produced by students in the Museum Studies seminar. The class is split into 3 teams to make the exhibition come together, as you will see this evening. The curatorial team sought out artists, secured their artwork, and designed the layout of the exhibition. The marketing team promoted the exhibition by making flyers, postcards, and advertising through various community and campus media. And finally, the programming team organized this panel discussion and created both a brochure and a website detailing the works and artists presented. Will the Museum Studies Seminar students please stand? In order to put this project together as a class, we first had to understand the concept of Qiyang. There are 6 fundamental principles of Chinese painting dating back to the 6th century, with Qiyang, or breath resonance and life movement, being the first. Other principles include a way of using the brush, depicting forms, laying on of colors, placing and arrangement, and copying of models. However, of the 6 principles, Qiyang has been the most discussed and probably the most debated. As we found out in trying to capture the essence of a Qiyang exhibition, the definition of Qiyang is not so clear-cut, but generally, art displaying Qiyang has some essential characteristics: vitality, movement, freedom, naturalness, and individual spirit. While the breadth of an artwork has been associated with brushstrokes, Qiyang can be present in works that do not use a brush and is not limited to painting. The presence of Qiyang within a work is subjective. Resonance is a feeling of being drawn to an artwork, whether visually or spiritually. One of the elements of Qiyang involves the idea of capturing and transmitting the inner spirit of the artist. Breath or resonance alone do not define a work as Qiyang, but rather the way breath and resonance come together to give vitality to the art. There are 6 artists featured in this exhibition: Heide Trepanier, Ron Johnson, Ray Kass, Ann Tarantino, Kate McGraw, and Deborah Ellis. The featured works by these artists present Qiyang in various ways. These 2 pieces by Heide Trepanier, Gulch on the left and Le Manger du Monde on the right, possess elements of breadth and vitality of the Qiyang principle. These are also examples of how Qiyang can be present in works that do not use a brush. Heide Trepanier uses the playful qualities of ketchup and mustard bottles to create whimsical environments that both dazzle the viewer and provoke colorful narratives. In these 2 paintings, Change is Coming on the left and Desert Stars Out from the Sky on the right, Ron Johnson employs the combinations of light and color that create movement and energy present in Qiyang. For Johnson, each piece is an animated game where aesthetic components battle for authority, a characteristic that directly applies the Qiyang idea that life can be captured through the simplest of forms. In these 2 works by Ray Kass, Canopy on the left and Goldenrod on the right, Kass uses traditional techniques of the Asian art form of watercolor to create a sense of nature, characteristic in Qiyang. Kass manipulates the essentials of painting to create muted interactions of natural processes. Ann Tarantino's artistic process relates directly to the concept of breath resonance. She uses her own breath to create delicately fluid abstract works that often draw from her own observations in nature. Here we have Breath Portrait Purpose. Kate McGraw and Ann Tarantino together create spiritual works that fuse 2 disparate energies into one. Through a process that seeks to visualize the collective unconscious, one is able to find depth and meaning in the collaboration of both artists. In this painting, we have, it's called After Six, and it's from the Potential Energy series. Here tonight to discuss Hsieh Ho and this exhibition, we have a panel including Dr. Stephen Addis, Dr. Erling Schvold, Zach Orphis, and Heide Trepanier. The panel will be moderated by Amanda Hodder. At this point, I will turn the program over to the panel. Enjoy.
Hello everyone, it's so good to see you all here tonight. My name, like Ashley mentioned, is Amanda Haviland, and I'm also part of the programming team for the Hsieh Ho exhibition, and I will also be the moderator tonight. I have the great pleasure to introduce our wonderful panelists this evening. First, we have Dr. Stephen Addis. He is a Tucker Boatwright Professor in the Humanities and an Art History Professor here at UR. Dr. Addis holds degrees from Harvard University and the University of Michigan and taught for 15 years at the University of Kansas before joining the faculty here at Richmond. He was recognized with the Distinguished Educator Award in 1999. His paintings, ceramics, and calligraphy have been shown internationally as well as throughout the United States. Dr. Addis was honored to receive grants from both the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Endowment for the Arts. He has published 36 books and exhibition catalogs, many on the subject of Eastern art. Next is Mr. Erling Schvold. He is an associate professor and chair of the Art and Art History Department at UR. He received his Master of Fine Arts from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Some of his works are currently on display in the University of Richmond's Harnett Museum in the exhibition titled Form and Story, Narration in Recent Painting. He was recently honored with the 2008-2009 Virginia Museum of Fine Arts Fellowship. His research focuses on the areas of drawing and painting. Heide Trepanier is currently an instructor of art here at UR and a distinguished visiting professor at Virginia Commonwealth University for graduate photography and film. She received her education at VCU as well, and Marchwitz School of Art in France, and the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She is the recipient of a VMFA Professional Art Fellowship. Her work has been on display in a solo exhibition titled New Paintings in Stuck's Gallery, New York, New York, and God Wars at the Reynolds Gallery in Richmond, Virginia, in addition to many other exhibitions. She has two works in the Hsieh Ho exhibition tonight that we are discussing. And lastly, we have Mr. Zach Orphis. He is a senior student at UR, is a double major in art history and classic civilizations. He is a member of the curatorial team that put together the Hsieh Ho exhibition on display tonight. So please join me in thanking our knowledgeable panelists for being here tonight. All right, now we'll start our discussion, and if you have any questions, please save them for at the end, and we'll take questions then. So, my first question is for Dr. Addison, Mr. Schvold, because I taught a class in Hsieh Ho last semester. So Hsieh Ho is a very specific and somewhat uncommon idea in Western culture. What inspired you to gear your course last semester around this topic?
Perhaps I'll start. Erling and I have been thinking how nice it would be to teach a course together for several years, and we wanted to pick a theme that would allow us to have both East and West, that would allow both history and the present day, and that would allow both art history and creativity and artwork. So we came up with the idea of Hsieh Ho, this old Chinese idea, that the most important thing for an artwork to have before everything else was this breath resonance, whatever that meant. People have been arguing in China ever since, but it's remained a very important issue. So we decided to get together and start with our students actually doing some brushwork, calligraphy and brush painting. We had a small Hsieh Ho exhibition of Chinese and Japanese works. last fall that I hope some of you saw to get us started. And then partway through the term, we switched to the present day, and I'll switch to Professor Hsieh Ho.
Well, one thing that interested me was thinking about a lot of contemporary art and how the China market has really boomed, and a lot of it has had a sort of the mark of Western culture on it. So a question I had is, well, what happens if we looked at the Far East, especially going to the ancient Far East, and what kind of ideas might we find there to think about the flow back towards the West? And after some conversation with Professor Addis, this idea of Qiyun seemed like a good one to begin, exploring a lot of contemporary Western art. We had some questions, however, is like in coming from the East to the West and looking at contemporary art, what traits would we be looking for? Should it illustrate traditional ideas of Qiyun as we understand it, or are there ways that we can start to expand the tradition or test the definition of that tradition? So we looked at explored ideas of color. Explicitly in the class, we did some panels where we took a very contemporary or modern medium like acrylic, which seemed like something antithetical to the tradition, and see, does this stand up? Can a work that has the qualities of Qiyun come out of that kind of medium? We also looked at works that could be sort of sustained and reworked, so it doesn't come out of the singular gestural mark and that kind of immediacy, but what happens to a work that has a true kind of history. And that seemed to be somewhat of a challenge to the history of the tradition as well. And the studio components seem to be the best way to explain that.
While we were planning this, of course, we went to Richard Waller, and he was kind enough to say, let's do it, and put on the first Qiyun exhibition and this one, and that he would then take on the second half of the year. And I think 3 students were here were in both seminars, or both classes, and take what we had done in the first seminar, which was a lot of working, and also beginning to choose possible artists and possible works. We all did field trips to galleries and museums and so forth. And the second class, which is the one we just heard about, would be the one then to take it and take our theories and ideas into fruition, and that's what I'm looking forward to seeing and hearing more about.
All right, great answer. Thank you for starting that off. Okay, Zach, since you were on the curatorial team, how did you and the other curators select these particular works, individually and as a whole, to represent Qiyun? We saw a few up on the PowerPoint earlier, but we get to see them all.
Well, as has been previously mentioned, Qiyun has been debated since the 6th century, and which leads to multiple interpretations of artworks that potentially express qualities of Qiyun. So therefore, the curatorial team had an exciting challenge in choosing works for this exhibition. We were given a lot of freedom in artists which we were potentially pursuing to include in this exhibition, but we also had to choose works which embodied this essence of Qiyun and breath resonance. So I guess how we chose the works goes back to Professor Addis and Professor Hsieh Ho's class last semester. And they were responsible for coming up with a list of artists, which they voted upon, who the students in that class thought expressed or had these qualities of Qiyun in their work. So the curatorial team was handed this list, and from that list, we met together as a curatorial team several times to kind of whittle it down and research the artists and decide on works which we as a team thought would best fit in our exhibition. This required long hours, almost every Tuesday night in the library. But after meeting with Professor Waller a couple times, we had come down with a body of artists we wanted to pursue, who we really wanted to be in our exhibition. From there, the next step in the process was to contact the artists or the galleries who represented them to see if these works or any works by these artists were even available for us. So we got in contact with the Reynolds Gallery, which is right here in Richmond, and also the curator's office from DC. And they were willing to let us borrow works for this exhibition. which were available. So when we first went to the Reynolds Gallery here in Richmond, we went to look at works by Heide as well as Kass. And while we were there, we actually kind of stumbled upon two more artists who we really thought embodied this essence of Hsieh, and that happened to be Ron Johnson and Deborah Ellis. So kind of by the process of going there and seeing the works, we came across two new artists who we really liked and wanted to incorporate in the show. In terms of the curator's office in DC, the class from the first semester had visited there, and they saw the exhibition Potential Energy, which is collaborative works by Tarantino and Kate McGraw. And I think for the curatorial team, this was kind of our focal point. We kind of really felt like these works really kind of hold it all together, this concept of Hsieh. And one of our curators, Garrett, was in contact with Anne herself, and through their correspondence, he got the impression from her that this was something she really felt was very valid and really a part of her work. Then going from there, after we had secured the works we wanted, we had to come up with a kind of a display and how the exhibition would come together. And as a curatorial team, we kind of decided that the way we wanted to organize the exhibition was to create a whole spectrum of art, so that you, as a viewer, could get a whole sense of Hsieh. And by this, I mean we went from works which were very gestural and focused on simple forms, such as a work by Kass or Ron Johnson, all the way up to a very figurative work by Deborah Ellis, which explores nature and is very representative of nature, and very figurative. And from this, we wanted there to be a flow throughout the exhibition, so that you would be able to experience kind of the whole body of Hsieh through all different types of art and the techniques artists use.
Great. All right, Heidi, the next question is for you. I know you're not an expert on Hsieh, but if you were to look back and reflect on your work and what you've learned so far, do you see elements of Hsieh in your paintings, like vitality and movement and individual spirit? Are those something you intentionally do, or you think happened on accident, or you don't see it at all?
I think it's all a byproduct of the process. There's several ways that I approach my work that could definitely apply to Hsieh. One of the ways that I approach and starting is to just throw paint. If I have a good idea of what I want to do, I have a very planned process that I work with. But if I don't, I find that what helps me to proceed to the next painting is to just get started by action, and that action likens itself a lot to abstract expressionist ways of approaching painting, but what it ends up doing is getting me started, so that I start with a mark that expresses movement, that shows a lot about I guess vibrancy, vitality, a lot of the things that you mentioned. But when I do that, I really feel like it is not my case. It's kind of a jumping off point. It's a starting point. And that's why some of the forms have the sense of movement that they do. And I feel like the decisions that I make, a byproduct of what they do is to have some of this resonance, some of this breath and vitality. But when I'm making a paint, I have a conscious narrative that I make. There's usually an overlying theme to what I do, and then there's subsets or meta-narratives from the general narrative that I'll work with, and each painting is a part of a larger story. So action that is taking place within the framework of the painting is a part of a larger story. If those forms that I make and outline do not match my theme, I sort of either set it aside or pull it off. So it's not just working with the gesture and just working with the idea of movement or space. I consider myself kind of a child of Western culture, very postmodern, very dogmatic about that approach, in that it has many layers to it. And I feel like one of the things that the West is great at is visual stimuli. And so there are many layers of that stimuli, but there's also many layers of meaning. And I feel like that's one of the things where it's almost opposed to Qigong, is that there's not simplicity in just the form. There's many, many things going on at once. There's narrative, there's action, there's form. There's also relationships, there's also appropriation, there's also different layers of form that reoccur within each one. So there's storytelling, and I feel like one of the things that I can guess Qigong is trying to do is have a simplicity of action or simplicity of form. So I feel like in some ways, yes, I do see that in my work, and I do understand how the work shows sensation. And in other ways, I feel like it might be a little bit of focus. So I'm interested also in finding out what other people feel.
What do you guys feel about Heide's works exhibit?
Before I talk about her works, or somebody talks about her works, what you're saying about your works is interesting, because I think you could describe a lot of Chinese painting that way too. I mean, it's not just the breadth, but it often refers to other paintings in the past. It often has a narrative, maybe a hidden narrative. It often has various levels. I think lots of great paintings are going to have lots of levels. But what distinguishes the Chinese idea, at least, is that no matter how many things are going on, and no matter how beautifully it's painted, and no matter what else, if it doesn't breathe, if it's not alive, then you've lost the essential ingredient. But not to say that that's the only ingredient. And I see in your work what you're saying, and I find that makes it extremely interesting, but not necessarily different from the kinds of paintings that were described as before.
Well, I think there's also an issue of intent, too. We talk about breadth, but it's really important to think about the resonance and how which maybe relates more to how it's received. And there's many works where, upon examination, can have a kind of method to them that doesn't seem to be about Qigong on the surface in terms of its execution. But these paintings do have a sense of breadth somewhere in them. So where is it? There's an attraction to them, I think, at least speaking for myself, that I might equate with works that are more sort of properly having the qualities of Qigong from the ancient Far East. So I have to think harder, what is going on in a painting like that? And I might even think of somebody as really distant, just for the sake of argument, like Hsieh, where I can see a certain Hsieh painting that seems antithetical. But when I look at it in particular works, there's a way in which all the components are orchestrated as a whole, and the way color or value and space starts to work, and it operates, and it has that quality of resonance. And it does seem to breathe, but it's doing it not through something as obvious as a gestural mark per se, but through the organization of the space and the balancing of some of its elements. But it's about it seems to me to have those qualities. Certainly it has the ideas of resonance, in it, but I'm just identifying it in a very different way, and probably very much against any intentions towards, overtly toward something like Qigong.
Okay, and I have a question kind of similar to what you were just touching on. So about the techniques such as color, brushwork, application, and paint in these works, tell us more about what parts they play in achieving Qigong. Like each artist in this exhibition uses very different gestures in their works. Like Heide uses the ketchup bottles, and Tarantino starts her paint by blowing through a straw. How do each of these different techniques all show breadth, even though they're all in different ways? And the brushwork, which was kind of the original idea in ancient Chinese painting.
I'll just take the topic of color, for example, as something different than the gestural mark. I can see in some obvious ways, like again, going back to people that may not come to mind immediately, like Cezanne, the way you might alternate complementary colors, or the way there's a kind of a pattern started here that's replicated down here. So it gets into these organizing principles, I think, a little bit. This also goes for the way that lines have conversations between one another. Organic marks to organic marks, or more rectilinear form to rectilinear form, those kinds of things. And it becomes a whole. And you can see in Cezanne's, for example, sort of unfinished pieces, how he begins these with an idea of breathing very clearly. And it's an idea of breath that's sustained even as they come into sort of a much more sort of full resolution. There's that sense of constant call and response in the application of paint that's very legible. I think for me he's an excellent example to think about qualities of Hsieh in a Western example, at least for me. But it also depends on being able to read, I think, the construction of painting, perhaps, if that's one way to answer it.
Great. Now, Zach, I've got another question for you. The curators for this Hsieh exhibition sought out contemporary paintings. I know that was part of the intention of the class, but other forms of art can incorporate or reflect Hsieh as well. Can you maybe expand on some examples of that, or which ones wouldn't?
That's an interesting question, because one of the decisions we had to make as a curatorial team was what art objects we wanted to include in the exhibition. We had toyed with the idea of including painting as well as sculpture or maybe photography. Ultimately, we came to the decision as a team that we wanted to focus primarily on painting to make the connection with contemporary artists painting and Hsieh as the first principle of Chinese painting. However, I do see Hsieh in other art mediums. For example, sculpture, what comes to mind for me right away when I think of sculpture is someone like Bernini. And the way he sculpts marble almost to imitate flesh. And you feel the life in the marble. And for me personally, I'm thinking of the sculpture of David as he's about to throw his slingshot at Goliath, and the expression on that sculpture's face. You feel breath within it, you feel life, you walk around it, and you view it from all its different angles. And for me, I see Hsieh in that because of the vitality through the sculpture's expression, and through the movement, and through the qualities that the sculptor expresses in his work. Also, drawing is another example. In terms of the collaborative pieces we have, Kate McGraw uses graphite and charcoal in her work. And I'm thinking of the work we have in the exhibition After 6, where you can really see the artist's presence with the movement, the circular movement of her forms, and the intense vitality and energy that is there just through using graphite or charcoal. So it doesn't just have to be painted. In terms of photography, it gets a little more complicated because photography, you're capturing a specific moment for all intents and purposes for the rest of the time. But I'm sure there are many people out there who could argue that a photograph does possess the qualities of movement and life. So I do agree that other art mediums do possess Hsieh, and as we said before, it is a very subjective principle. If it resonates within you and it moves you and you feel life and breath in the work, then the work has Hsieh.
Great. Now I have a question for anyone. Anyone can take it if they've got an answer to it. One of the characteristics that we've been talking about is individual spirit. Now, in this exhibition, we have several collaborative works by Kate McGraw and Anne Tarantino. So how does individual spirit play a part in their collaborative work?
Well, I should maybe take a shot at that. One of the things that the first seminar taught me, because it was this all an experiment to see what would happen if we take this old idea and apply it to new works, and including the works that we're doing. But the students were really good, and they came up with some terrific thoughts, which made me realize, or some of them may have even said directly, that each person has a little different breath. And what's more, each person breathes a little differently at different times. Rushing to class at the last minute, relaxing, after dinner, whatever it might happen. Meeting a friend after a long time. Your breathing actually is constantly changing, and yet it's always you, and yet it's always changing at the same time. And when two people get together, they obviously are interacting, and in a sense, their breathing can relate to each other's breathing to some extent. So when you see a collaborative work, how interesting. I mean, this was pretty rare in China and Japan. Not impossible, but pretty rare. And particularly to work more or less at the same time. People would work one after the other, maybe, or something. So in that, you see two different breaths sort of interacting, maybe in ways that echo each other, but maybe even more interestingly, I think, at least in some of the ones that I saw in Washington, where they are not echoing each other, but they're sort of responding to each other by saying, okay, I'm doing a little something different here. And yet they're still breathing, and their breath resonance and their breath patterns interact to form something new. Pretty interesting.
I think that artists are always in conversation with other artists. I think that artists are very influential to each other. I know personally, there's a new body of work. Ron Johnson is here, by the way. He's new body of work. That I personally have conversations with Rod in my studio. He has this new body of work, and I feel like he is, for lack of a better phrase, on game. He's got the right materials, the right colors, the right process involved to make the work that he is doing right now extremely high in craft, in purpose, in thought, and I guess what would be an idea of Hsieh Ho. And because of that, and because I've looked at his work for a bit, and I go into my studio and I start to have a little piece of that in my head, and I start to converse with them. So I think that artists just do that naturally too. So it's very possible to have two artists that work together that are speaking on the same piece, but they're also speaking to each other on different pieces too.
Okay, now I actually have a question on Ron Johnson's work that we can talk about. And Ron, if you have anything to say, just shout out. The work's by Ron Johnson. We thought to embody sustainability because there was many layers of paint applied over many different periods of time before its completion. So in your opinion, does this characteristic complement or contrast with the meaning of Hsieh Ho, with some of its elements? Anyone?
Well, there's a mention of history, is that process involved in it?
Yeah, well, it goes back to, I think, the earlier comment I was making with the students of wanting, we did the acrylic panel paintings, and the idea was to keep layering it, and there's a temptation to want to read Hsieh Ho as this kind of sort of unified single act, and either maybe it has it or doesn't. And it's a superficial way, perhaps, to look at it. So we just really wanted to say, well, what happens to work that has many layers to it, day after day after day. So it's the idea of this kind of breath resonance that becomes more of a daily act, perhaps, that can be sustained layer upon layer in the painting. So you might think of somebody like Giacometti, for example. I'm not sure that he would look at it that way in Hsieh Ho, but just that sort of deliberate working and working and working that takes on sort of a life of its own. But it's how do you re-engage it with that sort of freshness repeatedly? It's actually very, very difficult, I think. So we explored that in class, and there's a lot of, the results were varied along the way. Some people seem to find like this perfect moment sort of in the middle of the process or at the beginning, or it was sort of wayward, and then it wasn't until the very end it started to take on shape. So I thought that was a very interesting way to answer that question about history and having a sustained work. Because if you can confirm that works with that kind of history can have the qualities of Hsieh Ho, it really opens up the spectrum or the horizon for what kinds of works to look at, I think. In the case of Ron's paintings, I would look at them. I think they have that gestural mark on this that you see immediately, but on close inspection, you can see that there's a method in how this is all a process of accretion and some very careful method. And what I notice in those is you have the movement of the gesture, but what starts to really breathe for me is when I start to see the layers up close, and I see these kind of constant shifts between what's on top and what's on bottom with the So I start to locate the idea of the breath or the resonance more through that kind of slow oscillation of the spatial perception throughout, as opposed to the faster movement on the surface, which seems in some ways like a lure to get me in, but it yields to something which, so there's just something below the surface which becomes very engaging for me. So I think this becomes a very good example of that sort of sustained activity, and very, very much, in my mind, a part of that kind of embodying those kind of qualities of Hsieh, at least as I interpret it.
Can I ask if the artist has any comments?
I don't know that I would say anything different. I mean, I guess I'm not going to speak of this because I don't know so much about what it is, but I think kind of the layering process, I think I've talked earlier about this before, is kind of, it's a mystery to me sometimes because I don't know what's going to come out of it. So I put something down and literally I have to wait for paint to dry. I come back a day and I'll do other stuff, but like a day and a half later, the surprise to me sometimes is what happens through the layers. So, and I'm also interested in just like the idea of layering. It's that old adage of how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? That idea of I don't know how many layers sometimes, the painting is. I have to actually physically look and try to find the bands between, what you're saying, the breath, and figure out how many layers I've actually done, because I don't finish it until I feel like I'm finished.
Well, if I can just follow on that too, there's this element of chance when you talk about surprise. There's obviously things that as you work on, as you get experience, you can control things more, but it's still, there's always going to be this element of sort of chance that you're playing with that's really vital and important. This gets into Ray Kass's work also, so it's the degree of control and what we're surrendering to the properties of water or the density of acrylic in the polymers or anything, or working with ketchup bottles or blowing through straws. And so these just become different tools, but it still is sort of becoming a dialogue with this notion of intervention, I suppose, in the hand and in some degree intent, but also chance and letting the nature of the materials carry that sort of expression. So, it makes it complicated in terms of thinking about individual spirit when we're deferring so much of it to the operations of the materials themselves, I think. That seems to be well within the history of a lot of brush painting, for example.
Yeah, there was a crazy monk who did calligraphy with his hair. There's people who did finger painting. I mean, it wasn't just brushing in this case. Yeah. So the medium is certainly part of the dialogue or a trialogue.